We climate concerned citizens sometimes hear about the low carbon fuel standard, but few people actually know what it is. Can you please explain?
Yes, so the low carbon fuel standard is a regulation that is requiring a decrease in the carbon intensity of energy used in transportation. So, of course, mostly in transportation, we're using gasoline and diesel. And you might say, well, how can I decrease the carbon? There's only so much carbon in a liter of gasoline. There's always the same amount. But actually, one thing you can do is you could blend in more biofuels, so blend more ethanol in with the gasoline. And because the ethanol comes from growing crops of some kind, so it's a biological origin, and when those crops grow, they take carbon out of the atmosphere. Then when we say that you're using a biofuel, you've reduced carbon intensity, and therefore blending in biofuels is one way. Another is it could be that instead of using gasoline or a gasoline ethanol blend, we'll actually use more electricity or more hydrogen in transportation. So you might have heard of hydrogen fuel cells, but especially we've heard of electric cars. And so the people who are selling electricity for people recharging their cars, for example, or even an electric utility selling electricity to a transit company for its buses, those people also can, if we increase that, then it decreases the carbon intensity. And then finally, another way is even when you're making gasoline and diesel, you produce emissions, we call it upstream, like the refinery causes emissions, or even oil production, like the oil sands in Canada has a lot of emissions. So we say to the oil industry or the industry as a whole, if you can reduce emissions in the production of gasoline, or actually in the production of electricity or hydrogen, then any of those things will reduce the carbon content, the carbon intensity of energy used in transportation. So this regulation requires that to happen. And this low carbon fuel standard exists in California, which is where it originated in 2005 or 6, and it's in British Columbia and several other US states.
So sometimes people call the low carbon fuel standard a flexible regulation. Can you tell us why?
Right. Well, for a few reasons. One is I just gave you various options for how you could reduce the carbon intensity of energy used in transportation, but it doesn't say to industry, you have to do it this way by blending in biofuels or encouraging the sales of hydrogen and electricity or the emissions in the production of gas. It says you decide which is cheapest and easier to do in some way, and so that can lower the costs of this. And it also allows firms to trade among themselves. So if someone is selling more electricity for use in cars, they get a credit that they can then sell to the gasoline company. And what that means, though, is the gasoline company has to buy the credit, so the price of gasoline goes up, which is just like how a carbon tax would cause the price of gasoline to go up. In this case, it's because the gasoline company needs money to help subsidize the selling of electricity. And so there's still price effects from all of this. The price of gasoline would go up, but the price of the alternatives would go down, and that's how the regulation achieves the reduction overall in carbon intensity.
Now, how would you say does the low carbon fuel standard compare to a carbon tax for decarbonizing transportation?
I'm an energy economist, energy environment economist, and we economists have done a lot of studies on, what is the total cost to society of using a policy like a carbon price or a carbon tax to reduce emissions versus regulations. And in general, regulations are more costly. And that's important because you want to do it as cheaply as possible to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, because that leaves us more money as a society for healthcare, for education, and for more equity programs in our society. So that's good. But at the same time, when we look at a flexible regulation like the low carbon fuel standard and the way in which it works, it has a lot of similarities to a carbon price. It will still motivate some people because of that rising cost of travel by car, it'll motivate some to switch away to active transportation, like walking and cycling, or onto bikes, or else onto public transit. And it also motivates this greater efficiency in vehicles. Electric vehicles are more efficient, hydrogen vehicles are more efficient. And so because of all of this, when we've done comparisons of the two policies, so low carbon fuel standard versus carbon price for full decarbonization, their costs are not that much different. And so you might be interested in using a regulation instead of a carbon price if you think it's easier to do politically, that there's more public support for that, because climate policy is always difficult. And so that's a consideration that we shouldn't forget.